The Nashville mayor's office has called on the city's legal team to investigate the possible unauthorized release of the writings of Audrey Hale, the shooter who killed 3 children and 3 adults at the Covenant School in Nashville last March. Now, after conservative radio host Steve Crowder released what he said were images of the shooter's manifesto, Nashville Mayor Freddie O'Connell issued the following statement saying, "I am deeply concerned with the safety, security, and well-being of the people of Nashville who are grieving." The Metro Nashville Police Department said Monday the images were not MNPD crime scene images and that it was working with Nashville's legal department in the investigation.
Crowder posted a screenshot of an email he received asking for his comment on a New York Times story on the original video he posted on YouTube, which has since been removed, during which he read Hale's alleged manifesto. In response to the inquiry, he wrote, "We called it this morning. Expect hit pieces from left-wing media sources saying we released the Nashville Manifesto for clicks and clout, but in reality, we released it because the public had a right to know, and that it had a right to know a long time ago." He also posted that Instagram removed photos of the Nashville Manifesto from his account. Nashville Police Department released a statement possibly confirming the authenticity of the manifesto, writing, "I'm greatly disturbed by today's unauthorized release of the 3 pages of writings from the Covenant shooter. This action showed a total disregard for Covenant families as well as the court system, which has control of the shooter's journals at the present time." Okay. Sorry, I got a little confused because he was talking about left-wing sources, and I stalled out because I don't think of the New York Times as a left-wing source. But I understand what he's talking about, where he's coming from. First and foremost, we talked about the censorship of this. I think we agree that there's not a lot of basis for that.
And there's been more of it, by the way. I saw Ed Krasenstein, a popular Twitter account, saying that, or quote tweeting, the Babylon Bee, Seth Dillon, who said was flagged by YouTube for violating not the misinformation, incitement, hateful conduct policy, but the violent criminal organizations policy for their video. If the leaked Nashville shooter manifesto is legit, what does it say about censorship in the U.S.? And Krasenstein, who's Democrat side, saying that seems pretty absurd.
Yeah,
it does seem pretty absurd. What are we doing here?
That seems to be a patent misdirection of energy. If anything, the police department should be concerned about whether or not its policies were breached by the leaker in the first place. The issue is not the journalist who published it.
No.
From their perspective, if there's actually any wrongdoing here, it is that there's potentially a police officer who broke the rules at his job. This is an employment issue, and took this photograph. Now, when you look at the photograph, it does seem like it's taken from a car in a parking lot where there's another police car parked nearby. That may or may not be some circumstantial evidence that shows that, yeah, this was a cop who took it upon himself to leak this information. That's for the police department to get into. What I'm interested in is this characterization of the left liberals wanting to suppress this particular manifesto because it was especially damning to the interests of the left. And I was refreshing my memory about what arguments are being made about the suppression of this manifesto a year ago. One was that this was a manifesto that was going to demonstrate hatred rooted in the shooter's trans experience and directed toward Christians at a Christian school as a particularly maligned group, that this was a hate crime of sorts against Christians. And what has been so interesting about the 3 pages, at least, that have been revealed is, one, that the whole book wasn't revealed. Something selective was revealed. And 2, that the revelation, which I think we can read into that the juiciest part was revealed, that the part that the cop thought the public should know was revealed, didn't actually hit any of those touch points that conservatives were expecting the manifesto to cover a year ago.
Well, what it touches in the pages that were released, and I don't know, there could be, who knows what's in the rest of it, is language, is anti-white language, anti-wealth language. The shooter hated the people at the school who were wealthy, white, privileged people, used pejoratives for those terms. You're right, there's nothing about that we've seen so far in gender to speak of. Yeah, look, I'm not someone on the right, again, as we talked about yesterday, who thinks like the motives of psychotic mass killers are particularly interesting, or like probing their ideologies is a useful exercise. I brought that up in many times we've discussed criminals and killers, so I was never. I thought the manifesto should be released for basic fairness, because there's often we do get to read what the thoughts or learn more about the person, and it was weird that well, this one you can't see. So I'm glad it was released, and I'm glad people who were curious about this can see it. I just am very reticent to draw any conclusions in most cases from these kinds of things. But from what we're reading, it seems like this person, this violent psychopath, was professing hatred of white, and the shooter, by the way, is white, is wealthy white people. So, I don't know, interpret that as you will. I just don't think it matters very much.
I mean, what's interesting is it just wasn't an ideological document. And, look, who knows what's going to happen if the whole thing might end up being released at some point. But it's hard to imagine that someone, risked their job potentially to release these pages and didn't release the most kind of relevant to the public interest pages in the book. Could it be that 3 pages later there was an ideological call of arms for every trans person in America to rise up against the Christians of America? It's possible, but it seems very unlikely given the political posture of all of this. And to your point about whether or not this manifesto was treated differently than others, I'd have to do a survey. I don't know if anybody's really looked at all of the many mass shooters that we have in this country over the years, and whether or not their manifestos have been released, whether or not the manifestos were released because they were already existent online. That's a thing that happens sometimes, or they're not really manifestos, but they are political statements that are made in chat boards and message rooms and stuff like that, that obviously cannot be kept private the same way that written thoughts in a handwritten journal obviously can be locked down by a police department and not disseminated. So how much of what we know about other manifestos is because they were made public by the shooter versus made public by the police department? I'm open to the idea that manifestos that are indictments of conservative or right-wing views are put out there more. I just would like to see the information. I would like to see the data on it.
And we would just like some consistency here for, and obviously there's different agencies, but the police should have the same procedure for all these kinds of things, and the social media companies should, and journalists should. If we're all, look, I'm perfectly willing to buy into it's better to just ignore these things, because frankly, I don't think they tell us a whole lot. I don't think this is a useful exercise. And maybe they inspire. One of the fears is that this inspires copycat killers or people who are dangerous read into this and want to do something like this because you've given this person all this attention. You're reading their diary, and that might be a thrill for someone in a similar situation. I don't know that that's been so definitively proven or demonstrated, but I hear that concern. And I don't think it is so useful to know. But you have to, contrast that with the people should have the right to information, even if it's harmful. What counts as harmful information? We don't want people in positions of authority to be able to decide that for the rest of us.
But isn't that a question about whether journalists choose? Because sometimes journalists are like, I'm not going to report the manifesto. I'm not going to. The Times will say, I'm not going to write anything about the manifesto. But isn't that a different question from, again, this is a police department. I think a lot of law enforcement officials say, we don't want these things to be out there because we are concerned about copycats.
Right.
Isn't that a relevant distinction here? And that maybe what's making this case so different is that Hale wrote their thoughts in a journal as opposed to like what most young people do these days, which is put it on the internet where it can be found.
Yeah.
One other point that's worth remembering about this case, Hale bought, I think, a number of guns, 7 firearms legally, had kept them at home. The shooter's parents knew that they had bought 1 gun and sold it, but believed that was the extent of it. Hale, there were no red flag laws in Tennessee that would have allowed, if the parents had raised some concerns to the public, the court to step in and take the firearms away from Hale. And regardless, it doesn't look like the parents ever made anybody more broadly aware of their concerns about their child and potential mental health issues.
Which, frankly, is starting to become something of an outlier. Because what was the other? There was another mass shooting we discussed recently. I can't recall what the
main shooting.
Right, and it turned out, he had an army background. He had a military background.
Hale also had some weapons training, but yeah. And had specifically made threats about shooting up his training base.
And nothing was done about it.
Had been flagged and flagged and flagged, but there was no red flag law also in Maine.
But there was no red flag law, but there was the military people he reported to should have been empowered to take away the weapons and just chose not to. The whole, see something, say, everybody, so many of the times we read that police were notified and medical people were notified. And if it's a young person, the school was notified. And the FBI was notified. And nothing happens.
Yeah.
It's very frustrating.
Yeah.
Well, conservative commentator Candace Owens reported on X yesterday that she received word 2 officers are due to be fired over the release of the Nashville Manifesto pages, and that allegedly the documents were sold by one of the officers. She also said she was contacted by a source with more concrete information regarding all of the details of the shooter's notebooks and what the true motivation was.
Owens also commended Crowder's release of the pages, saying this was great work, which will lead to major answers for parents like myself who live in the Covenant community and have been infuriated by the lack of information presented to the public.
These two, remember, had a long-running feud over Crowder potentially joining the Daily Wire and then that deal falling apart after he complained about it.
Now, if it's demonstrated, which it has not been, but if it were demonstrated that Crowder induced a police officer to share the information by paying them money to do that.
That
is not the same as journalism. That is not the same as the Julian Assange scenario. That is a very different scenario.
Yeah, it's a journalistic no-no. You cannot pay a source for information because that incentivizes them to
to induce them to commit. Well, I don't know that this would be a crime, but to induce them to violate the law. That's the problem here. That would be conceivably the problem here. So I do wonder if there's going to be further investigation into that. Also, I'm not entirely clear how the information that is now out from this manifesto keeps anybody more safe. What did we glean from it that keeps a family like Candace Owens more safe in this community? And after the Maine shooting just a few weeks ago, a prominent pro-gun rights Democrat, because Maine's one of those states where, like Vermont, where it's very common for people on both sides of the aisle to be very vociferously defending gun rights and opposing various gun safety legislations, flipped just because of the sheer magnitude of the tragedy and the avoidability of it all, given the absence of red flag laws, immediately took to the podium and said, look, I revised my position on this. These 19 people dead and more shot across my state, it just isn't worth it. These people are out here, and there needs to be some mechanism to keep them from inflicting this level of tragedy. Those are the kind of conversations that, it seems to me, are making communities safer. I'm not sure that knowing that this shooter, Audrey Hale, was motivated by a kind of anti-elite bias, someone who was upset by her own economic precarity and was taking it out on others. I'm not sure that's keeping anybody safer.
More Rising right after this.